Hey everyone, it's Austin back again with another video for Human Ideals. I know it's been a long time since I posted another video, and about 2 months ago, I think, which I know is a long time, I promised that I would post some of my interviews that I've come up with, but in the meantime, in between, I will be sharing some of my essays, which is what I'm going to be doing for you guys today. So this essay I'll be sharing is from a class I took last semester. It's called IR 331, The Global Economy 2040. I don't know if some of you know this, but this year I switched from being a communication major to an international relations global business major. So I think that was a better choice for me, simply because communication was way too theoretical and it didn't teach me some of the practical aspects of politics and economics that I've learned in IR. So anyways, in this class, I learned about many topics like AI, automation, blockchain, how the international financial system works, some of the financial crises that have gone on in the world, like the one in the U.S. From 2007 to 2008, the infamous global financial crisis. And so, learning about these topics, the professors brought in guest speakers on these topics every week. We had a new guest speaker, one or two per week, and each were experts in their own field. And so, from these discussions, I was inspired to write an essay on the state of the financial system in Myanmar, and specifically how the two-party government between the military party and the National League for Democracy, which is the party of Aung San Suu Kyi, who in December was held on trial for the genocide of the Rohingya, which right now, in this situation, I did research on the Rohingya in 10th grade, so I know there are a lot of atrocities committed against them. And at the same time, there is a lot of talk amongst Burmese people about, whether they should be classified as Rohingya or not. So I try to stay out of it. I still have to do more research on that issue. And so Myanmar is in a very conflicted, controversial time right now. But I think with this essay, I can bring a lot of change. Human Ideals can bring a lot of change to the country. Added to the essay I shared last time, which was on rural migration and improving the urban political system. So anyways, the main thesis of this paper is basically that Myanmar should transition from its former state capitalist system to a system of market capitalism, and I support this argument by citing various case studies like economic developments in the US, China, Singapore, etc. So anyways, that is what I'll be sharing with you guys for this essay, and I hope you enjoy this video. Ever since the National League for Democracy won the 2012 by-elections in Myanmar, it has cooperated with the Union Solidarity and Development Party, the party of the military government, in reducing financial corruption throughout the country. This corruption is present in bureaucratic forms such as facilitation payments, bribery, and rent-seeking, in oligarchic forms, as seen in the deregulation and privatization of state assets, and in organized crime through ceasefire agreements. Interactions between public officials, private stakeholders, and citizens show that none of these groups are responsible exclusively for the instability of the financial system. Essential to its structural stability is macroprudential regulation, an approach that mitigates endogenous risk to the whole system rather than its individual financial institutions, relying on measures like countercyclical capital buffers to do so. Citizens lacking financial literacy and technological infrastructure may obstruct financial reform in their inefficient use of monetary aid. State capitalism shows that financial corruption can be resolved through interventionist reforms such as higher salaries for civil servants, professionalization, and anti-corruption bodies. But market capitalism offsets its pitfalls through greater subsidization for social services, demonopolization, and the absence of political party machines. Since financial corruption is hardly separable from its forms, the latter is more feasible for the Myanmar government. State capitalism shows that bureaucratic corruption in facilitation payments, bribery, and rent seeking can be alleviated through higher pay for civil servants. The police force is notorious for demanding bribes from citizens. Quote, "Unfortunately, police corruption persists in Myanmar today because policemen have wide scope to engage in intimidation and extortion, and they seek positions that permit them to solicit bribes, which are known as tea money or beer money." End quote. These bribes are reinforced by the culture of gift giving in Myanmar, not only to public officials, but between family members, relatives, friends, and even business partners as well. This is prevalent in the practice of bidding for government tenders. Quote, "Gifts in the form of cash money will change hands, typically both at the securement stage and also usually at the completion, launch, and/or opening stage of the project concerned. Bidders who lose out will often gift gifts such as gold, diamonds, and money regardless, in the hope of securing the next favored concession." End quote. The inadequate salaries of civil servants, ranging from $120 to $180 per month to upwards of $200 per month for police officers, can be compensated through professionalization, which involves raising the standards of public institutions. Quote, "In the 1980s, Lee Kuan Yew also introduced much higher pay for public officials and promoted professionalism and ethical standards for the public service, including the creation of a university-based public policy school for providing expert training in public policy and administration." End quote. Higher salaries for civil servants does come with a trade-off of increased taxation on citizens. Given their low minimum wage as of 2019, which is 4,800 chats or $3.15 in US dollars, the government will not receive enough tax revenue, decreasing subsidies for basic social services such as healthcare, education, and environmental management. According to Mustafa Tapur, an inequality campaign lead for Oxfam, this can be attributed to over-reliance on indirect taxes. Quote, "Myanmar relies on indirect taxes that hurt the poor more and create inequalities. It collects less overall revenue and spends less on education, health, and social protection than Thailand." End quote. Market capitalism offsets this pitfall of state capitalism through demonopolization, allowing more firms to enter the market and increase competition. The United States government implemented such reforms between 1975 and 2000. Quote, "In telecommunications, federal action broke up AT&T as a public utility and deregulated the telecommunications industry, allowing new firms, technologies, and products to enter the market. In addition, federal laws eliminated price and entry regulations in the transportation industry, including airlines and trucking. This would also raise the number of foreign firms entering the market, and subsequently the amount of foreign investment the country receives. The Myanmar government is heading in this direction, conforming to policies set by the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and Asia Development Bank, which is why, quote, foreign companies have been increasingly bidding for tenders, end quote. This, however, is obstructed by oligarchic client networks created from deregulation and the privatization of state assets. These assets are sold to an exclusive group of military officials, which means that even if more firms enter the market, those owned by these officials or domestic firms that can acquire military connections will be more competitive than foreign firms, reducing incentives for foreign investment. This can be mitigated through the creation of a reliable anti-corruption body, a significant factor in the prosperity of Singapore and China. Lee Kuan Yew enacted the Prevention of Corruption Act in 1960 to establish an anti-corruption body called the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, or CPIB. It has the protection of being independent of police agencies and administration, allowing it, quote, to investigate corruption in the public and private sectors, to detain suspects of corruption without due process, and to impose 5-year sentences and up to $100,000 in fines. Xi Jinping, the president of China, has taken a more innovative approach to this, not only through the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, or CCDI, but also in authorizing, quote, public exposure methods to reveal corruption, including an anti-corruption anonymous reporting app with space to upload photographic evidence, end quote. This shows that even though public officials, private stakeholders, and citizens all contribute to corruption, there is the possibility of them cooperating to alleviate it. By raising the ease of market entry, market capitalism allows information and communication technology firms to develop such applications. Of course, citizens may misuse this by spreading misinformation. This occurred in 2016 when the Rohingya crisis was at its height. Quote, consider the case of journalist and translator Aung San Suu Kyi, who in November 2016 was targeted online after users began circulating a picture they claimed showed him standing with members of the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army. Aung San Suu Kyi was not in the photo, and it took several attempts and flags for Facebook to finally remove the post, end quote. In terms of a formal anti-corruption body, Myanmar has established the Anti-Corruption Commission, or ACC, but it is still influenced by powerful military interests, changing its body of staff members with each election. Its lack of independence from oligarchy illustrates why corruption is hardly separable from its forms. Under state capitalism, corruption and privatizing state assets, making military-connected firms more competitive, is inseparable from its form of deregulation, which can otherwise increase competition under market capitalism, acting as a shift towards demonopolization. The ineffectiveness of the Anti-Corruption Commission was documented in the report that, quote, the ACC allegedly investigated only 66 out of the 4,500 allegations of corruption it received up until 2017, while little more than 1,000 cases were forwarded to line ministries for, quote, internal investigations, end quote. Collusion between public and private interests, similar to the military owning its own firms in privatization, is also found in political machines. During the late 19th to early 20th century, political party machines in the United States served, quote, private industry through the railroads, providing cheap land and private development rights in exchange for kickbacks and political support, end quote. In Myanmar, however, private firms are provided such services in exchange for human rights violations. Myanmar Economic Holdings Limited, or MEHL, and the Myanmar Economic Corporation, MEC, are among a conglomeration of so-called crony companies that, quote, finance development projects in Rakhine State, such as the construction of a barrier fence along the Myanmar-Bangladesh border that furthered the military's objective of re-engineering the region in a way that erases evidence of Rohingya belonging to Myanmar, end quote. A way to dismantle this political machine is by urging foreign firms to invest in companies not associated with the military, rather than, quote, supplying them with fighter jets, armored combat vehicles, warships, missiles, and missile launchers, end quote, as over 14 foreign firms did in 2016. Because the monopoly of military-connected firms is reduced under market capitalism, non-military domestic firms can lead this initiative. This will incentivize the Union Solidarity and Development Party to form a new agreement, promising foreign firms to abstain from further violations. Its 7-year roadmap to democracy would be open up to compromise with the NLD, reversing the stance of General Than Shwe in 2007. Quote, one of Than Shwe's right-hand men, Brigadier General Jo Sen, said during a press conference that the junta will not open up the process of writing the Constitution to opposition groups or figures, even though the international community, including China, has called for an inclusive process in writing the Constitution and a national reconciliation, end quote. Removing foreign military funds would not dismantle this political machine in itself. Stopping the organized crime associated with ceasefire agreements will also be needed. Quote, in some cases, Former rebels have received legal concessions to exploit resources upon signing ceasefire agreements, allowing the military state to increase its influence over capital flows in disputed territories." End quote. These rebel groups are then co-opted into the client networks mentioned above, strengthening the, quote, crony companies committing human rights violations. The Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, founded by the G7 countries, can expose money laundering associated with control over these capital flows. It had already blacklisted Myanmar under the list of non-cooperative countries and territories, or NCCT, in 2001, forcing the government to comply with anti-money laundering, or AML, legislation and create a National Financial Intelligence Unit, or FIU. Listed under the FATF recommendations is the assessment of risk to the country that money laundering poses. The main risk is terrorist financing and the financing of, quote, not only terrorist acts, but also the financing of terrorist organizations and individual terrorists, even in the absence of a link to a specific terrorist act or acts, end quote. This should be criminalized. These are the steps in confiscating property associated with terrorist financing. Quote, A. Identify, trace, and evaluate property that is subject to confiscation. B. Carry out provisional measures, such as freezing and seizing, to prevent any dealing, transfer, or disposal of such property. C. Take steps that will prevent or void actions that prejudice the country's ability to freeze or seize or recover property that is subject to confiscation. And D. Take any appropriate investigative measures. End quote. Co-opted rebel groups are less prone to acts of terrorism as they have signed or agreed to ceasefire agreements. Nevertheless, this does not prevent groups outside of the ceasefire agreements from engaging in terrorism, and capital flows acquired by the co-opted groups can be hijacked. On August 15, 2019, the Taung National Liberation Army, or TNLA, attacked a police security outpost in Naocho Township, killing 7 soldiers and 3 police officers in the process. To prevent such acts, these FATF recommendations must be implemented without strengthening the oligarchy of military interests, knowing that this group has rendered the Anti-Corruption Commission ineffective. However, quote, the AML regime was constructed not to tackle money laundering or the predicate crime of drugs trafficking per se, but rather to undermine peripheral groups considered disloyal to the ruling regime, end quote. With market capitalism, this ulterior motive can be thwarted through demonopolization, and the increased competition between non-military firms will weaken the oligarchy. Another risk that money laundering poses is destabilizing the national financial system. Macroprudential regulation mitigates endogenous risks or threats within the system itself, rather than exogenous risks to institutions such as commercial banks. In Myanmar, these risks come in the form of insolvency and barriers to collective action. Quote, when the value of a bank's assets, mostly loans, falls below that of its debt, deposits, and bonds, the value of the bank to its owners, or capital, becomes negative. The bank becomes insolvent and its depositors lose money. Since bank insolvency can spread to other financial institutions, regulators set a minimum capital requirement, end quote. This capital can be used as a countercyclical capital buffer, or CCYB. When the value of assets declines in a recession, banks can pay for liabilities to their depositors without filing for bankruptcy. In a quantitative analysis of countercyclical capital buffers, Miguel Castro projects that these buffers, with a stimulus of $2.5 trillion in aggregate consumption, could have eased the recession of the 2007 to 2009 global financial crisis. Since the Central Bank of Myanmar law was enacted in 1990, Myanmar has adopted the CAMELS framework of financial regulation, which stands for C, capital adequacy, A, asset quality, M, management soundness, E, earnings, L, liquidity, and S, sensitivity to market risk. Countercyclical capital buffers are a function of the first foundation, capital adequacy, and Myanmar has made use of them in the past. Quote, capital injection is necessary for the soundness of the banks. In Myanmar, the paid-up capital of private banks increased 15 times within 8 years from 2003 to 2004 to 2010 and 2011, end quote. Ensuring their successful use in the future requires the strengthening of capital reserves in smaller, weaker banks, not only through capital injections, but by consolidating them into larger public banks, such as the Myanmar Citizens Bank and First Private Bank. Barriers to collective action can be resolved by adopting the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or FCPA, of the United States. In 2010, this legislation was amended as part of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. Filing lawsuits against international rights violations was initially limited to non-U.S. residents, but the amendment allowed private citizens to, quote, also have the right to be compensated for helping stop corruption, end quote. This was done by incentivizing citizens with shares from monetary sanctions in Section 922, quote, if an individual voluntarily provides the government with original information about a violation of the FCPA, and if that information leads to monetary sanctions of $1 million or more, then the individual shall be awarded 10 to 30% of the sanctions, end quote. The success of this incentive was shown in the Egan versus Trading Screen Incorporated trial of 2011, making it one of the first ever whistleblower cases of Dodd-Frank. Quote, plaintiff Patrick Egan was employed by Trading Screen and learned that Trading Screen's CEO, Felipe Buchanek, was diverting corporate assets. The independent directors hired Latham and Watkins to conduct an investigation, which confirmed plaintiff's allegations, end quote. Myanmar, however, requires additional considerations for incentives like Section 922 to be successful. Section 1504, for instance, quote, requires U.S.-listed mining, oil, and natural gas companies to report their payments to the U.S. and other governments around the world, reducing risks of opaque and corrupt transactions in sectors where risks are already elevated, end quote. By disclosing such payments, extractive firms in Myanmar could end up terminating their contracts, and the government could exploit this by prohibiting disclosures under law. Neither FATF nor the Anti-Corruption Commission can prevent the government from doing so, as the former only has the ability to expose corruption and not mandate laws, while the latter is controlled by military interests. This means that collective action must be privatized for it to be effective, and under market capitalism, technology firms can make reporting violations more accessible, as seen in the anti-corruption anonymous reporting app of Xi Jinping. They can provide citizens with their own compensation in the form of cash rewards or shares of stock, not having to rely on funds from the government. Improving the financial literacy of citizens is the last part of reducing financial corruption in Myanmar. Unlike the other forms of corruption, where other parties, be it citizens and bribery, private firms and political party machines, or rebel groups in ceasefire agreements, are manipulated for the gain of military interests, low financial literacy prevents citizens from making full use of government subsidies and support programs. This destabilizes the financial system even further on top of the endogenous macroprudential risks. The effects of poor spending habits were shown in a study conducted by Emma Aguila, Ph.D., in Yucatan, Mexico, comparing the effectiveness of different non-contributory pension programs. These pensions do not require employees to contribute their salary and retirement savings and are covered by employers entirely. A comparison of results from monthly and bi-monthly pension programs showed that, quote, the monthly program induces smoother consumption than the bi-monthly program, resulting in larger improvements in food availability and healthcare use. The bi-monthly program had larger effects on ownership of durable goods, such as cell phones and bicycles, end quote. Reducing the frequency of food shortages or increasing the frequency of spending in smaller amounts is essential for villages in poor regions like Rakhine State, a region where 8 out of 10 people, according to a 2014 World Bank assessment, were reported to be living in poverty. Village Savings and Loans Associations, or VSLAs, can teach villagers to manage their savings assigning different roles such as chairpersons, cashiers, bookkeepers, and record keepers. This will not only improve financial management in households, but also generate more savings for villages and other communities on infrastructure. Quote, this extra cash enabled Matandemu, a mother of twins, to invest in her business and to buy her husband a net for catching prawns. The 25-year-old says she has learned to budget and to invest in her clothing business, which returns a sufficient monthly profit to cover her son's education and food. Once these financial training programs are implemented, the technological infrastructure needed for savings can be developed. Some of the most common obstacles to development include limited digital access, a lack of cooperation between stakeholders, or even distrust in technology for fear of losing familiar ways of cash management. Ernan Galperin, PhD, provides a case study of this through Prospera Digital, a financial inclusion program designed to empower women through government-to-person, or GDP, payments. The participants all received their payments, quote, through an electronic bank account with associated debit or chip cards, end quote. However, their unfamiliarity with the payment system, combined with low mobile ownership at 50% of the total participants, led to problems such as fear of losing the cards, withdrawing funds all at once to not lose them, not knowing how to use the ATM, and being unaware that they even had bank accounts. Myanmar faces fewer obstacles regarding unfamiliarity and digital access due to its high rate of mobile ownership. The reliability of debit cards and ATMs in the country, which dictates the transferability of payments to citizens from the government, is a greater issue. Quote, Damui Township resident Do Mumu said, quote, cards would be useful if we didn't have to go to the bank, but if the local ATM has run out of cash, you have to go to the bank anyways, end quote. In Prospera Digital, the financial and technological illiteracy of participants resulted from the existing lack of technological infrastructure or the low rate of mobile ownership. Myanmar must therefore use market capitalism in developing the latter, an overlooked aspect of stabilizing its financial system. The three interacting groups in Myanmar, public officials, private stakeholders, and citizens, each have unique responsibilities in alleviating financial corruption. The government must work towards professionalization by providing higher salaries, quality training for civil servants, and stricter standards through its institutions. However, state capitalism makes it difficult to do so without sacrificing basic social services. This is why market capitalism is needed for the increased competition that comes with demonopolization. Out of all the reforms mentioned, demonopolization will create the most change, as it compensates for the ineffectiveness of government-owned anti-corruption bodies, drawing profits away from military-connected firms in the market. On top of preventing human rights violations, where foreign firms avoid trade with the offending crony companies, demonopolization also stabilizes the financial system through technological infrastructure. These reforms may not be sufficient, which is why exogenous intervention through the FATF recommendations or endogenous improvements through macroprudential regulation will be needed. If military interests continue to engage in bureaucratic or oligarchic corruption, market capitalism will prevent them from staying competitive through demonopolization, forcing them in the long run to elect a more representative body of officials to the Anti-Corruption Commission.